My name is Charlie. After years of service as a soldier, I thought I'd found peace with Lucy, my girlfriend, in our small apartment. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, a quiet refuge from the noise in my head and the memories I carried. Lucy had a way of grounding me, her laughter and warmth filling the empty spaces left by my time in the military. For a while, it felt like we were building something solid, a foundation strong enough to weather anything. Then her brother, Mark, entered the picture. Lucy had always spoken of him with a mix of love and sadness. She'd tell me stories of their childhood, how he was once full of life, protective of her, the kind of brother anyone would want. But the man who showed up at our door was a ghost of that boy, hollowed out by years of addiction. His eyes, sunken and bloodshot, darted around the room like he was searching for something he'd lost and knew he'd never find. At first, I tried to understand. He was family, and Lucy believed she could help him. "He just needs a little stability," she'd say, her voice tinged with hope. But stability wasn't enough to break the hold his addiction had on him. He'd disappear for days, then come, back desperate, his hands trembling as he muttered excuses I'd heard too many times before. When he stayed, it wasn't much better. The apartment felt smaller with him there, every corner filled with his restless energy and the tension that followed him like a storm cloud. Mark saw me as an intruder. I could feel his hostility in the way he spoke to me, his words sharp and loaded with contempt. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he'd spit, his voice low but venomous. I'd learned to stay calm under pressure, but Mark tested my limits. He'd steal from us, small things at first, a watch, a few dollars from Lucy's purse. When confronted, he'd explode, his anger filling the room like shrapnel. Lucy would step between us, her voice trembling as she begged us to stop. "He's your brother," she'd plead, though the words were meant for herself as much as, for me, every day felt like walking on a minefield waiting for something to explode. I started sleeping lighter, my body on edge even in the safety of our home. Lucy's optimism began to crack, her smiles less frequent, her eyes heavy with worry. I wanted to protect her, but how could I when the threat was someone she loved one night? I woke to the sound of muffled voices. I found Mark in the living room, rifling through our drawers. He didn't even try to hide it. "What are you doing, Mark?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. He turned to me, his face a mask of defiance. "What I have to do," he snapped. That's when I saw it, a flicker of desperation, of a man, cornered by his own choices. But pity couldn't outweigh the growing sense of danger. I knew then that this fragile peace couldn't last. It all came crashing down one night, a storm raging both outside and within the walls of our small apartment. Mark had been gone for 3 days, and Lucy was beside herself with worry. She'd barely eaten, her eyes constantly flicking to the door as though willing him to walk through it. When he finally did, the tension in the room was suffocating. His face was pale, and his clothes hung loose on his frame, but his eyes burned with a frantic energy that set my instincts on edge. "Where have you been?" Lucy asked, her voice a mix of relief and frustration. Mark ignored her, heading straight for the kitchen. I heard the clatter of drawers being opened, the scrape of utensils being moved aside. I followed him, already bracing for another argument. "Looking for something?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. He spun around, a steak knife in his hand. His grip was tight, his knuckles white. "Don't start with me, Charlie," he snapped. "I've had enough of your judging." "I'm not judging," I replied calmly, though every muscle in my body was tense. "But you're not helping yourself or Lucy by acting like this." "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" he hissed, stepping closer. "The big, tough soldier who can do no wrong." Lucy appeared behind me, her face pale. "Mark, please, just put the knife down. Let's talk." "No, you're always taking his side," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You think he cares about you? He'll leave you the second things get hard. That's what people like him do." The words cut deeper than I expected, but I didn't let it show. I stepped forward, my hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mark, you need help. This isn't the way." He lunged, but I was ready. I sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting, until the knife clattered to the floor. He cried out, more in frustration than pain, and Lucy screamed, rushing to separate us. "Stop it, both of you," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "You're tearing us apart." Mark pulled away, his chest heaving. "This isn't over," he muttered, storming out of the apartment and slamming the door behind him. Lucy sank to the floor, her tears falling freely. I wanted to comfort her, but the truth was clear. Something had to change, or we'd all be destroyed. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. "Lucy," I said softly, kneeling beside her, "I can't stay. Not like this." Her tear-filled eyes met mine, and I saw the heartbreak in them. "I love you, but if I stay, this will only get worse." She didn't argue. She just nodded, her sobs the only sound in the room. The next morning, I packed my things and left, carrying the weight of her broken heart and my own. I knew I was doing the right thing, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. Leaving Lucy was supposed to bring clarity, a step toward reclaiming control over my life. But Mark's shadow followed me like a specter, never allowing me the peace I sought. At first it was subtle, a sense of being watched, a fleeting shape in my periphery. I dismissed it as paranoia, an after effect of my military instincts and the tension I'd carried from the apartment. But it soon became clear. This wasn't just in my head. One night, after a long shift at the warehouse, I caught sight of him. Mark stood beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp, his gaunt frame leaning against the post. The orange light cast deep shadows on his hollowed cheeks, his eyes locked onto me with a chilling intensity. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stared. I clenched my fists, but I kept walking, forcing myself to appear indifferent. Confronting him then would have been a mistake, one I couldn't afford to make. His appearances grew more frequent. I'd spot him lingering at the edges of crowds, a phantom blending into the urban sprawl. The tension was suffocating, the kind of unease that tightened every muscle and made sleep a distant memory. My days blurred into a haze of restless vigilance. Footsteps echoed behind me on dark streets, shadows stretched unnaturally long under streetlights, and my instincts screamed with every turn of a corner. One evening, I returned home to find scratches. On my door's lock, the metal gouged as if someone had tried to force their way in. My heart pounded as I swept through the apartment, every room, every shadow inspected with military precision. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. Mark wasn't just watching anymore. He was escalating. The memories I'd buried during my service began clawing their way back. The tension of patrols, the ever-present danger, the cold clarity of survival. My breathing grew shallow as I felt the walls of my apartment closing in, the weight of combat stress melding with the current threat. This wasn't just psychological, it was physical, real, and present. Seeking advice, I reached out to Travis, an old army buddy who'd always had a knack for pragmatism. "You need to be ready, Charlie," he said over the phone, his voice a low, steady anchor. "Mark's pushing boundaries. Don't let him catch you off guard." Taking his words to heart, I began preparing. My routines shifted. Different routes to work, altered schedules, varying my patterns to stay unpredictable. I purchased a small but sturdy knife, a familiar weight in my pocket, a precaution I hoped I'd never need. Each day became a calculated series of moves, a chess game where the stakes were survival and sanity. Despite my precautions, Mark's pursuit never wavered. His obsession had consumed him, driving him closer to the edge with every passing day. One night, I awoke to the sound of glass shattering. My heart leapt as I grabbed the knife from beneath my pillow and moved silently toward the living room. There, amidst the shards of the broken window, stood Mark. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged, and his trembling hands clutched a crowbar. "You think you can just walk away?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You ruined everything." "Charlie," I raised my hands, my tone calm but firm. "Mark, put the crowbar down. This doesn't have to end like this." "Shut up," he shouted, advancing a step. You took her from me. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're nothing. Nothing. The distance between us evaporated in seconds. Mark swung the crowbar, the whoosh of displaced air sharp in the silence. I sidestepped, adrenaline sharpening my senses, and grabbed his wrist. The struggle was brief but intense, a chaotic dance of raw emotion and survival instinct. With a twist and a push, I disarmed him, sending the crowbar clattering to the floor. Mark collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving, tears streaming down his face. "She was all I had," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "You took her from me." For a moment, I saw the broken man behind the aggression, the brother Lucy had once described with such warmth. But pity couldn't undo the damage, and it wouldn't. Protect me from his spiraling descent. I called the police, my voice steady despite the chaos. When they arrived, Mark offered no resistance. As they led him away, he turned to me one last time, his gaze filled with a mix of hatred and despair. "This isn't over," he whispered. As the sirens faded into the night, I stood alone in the wreckage, my breath slow and measured. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. Mark's shadow might be gone for now, but its presence lingered, a reminder that some scars never fully heal. The days following Mark's arrest were a blur of silence and unease. The shattered window in my apartment had been replaced, but the cracks in my psyche remained. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside, kept me on edge. I told myself the worst was over, that Mark's arrest was a turning point. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The police had assured me that Mark would face charges for breaking and entering, for threatening me with a weapon. They saw it as an open and shut case, a simple matter of law and order. But I couldn't shake the look in his eyes as they took him away. That mix of hatred and sorrow, a man cornered by his demons and lashing out at the world. It wasn't just anger that drove him, it was despair. I tried to move forward. Work became my refuge, the rhythmic monotony of warehouse shifts grounding me in a way little else could. But the nights were harder. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by dreams of shattered glass and Mark's voice hissing accusations in the dark. I'd wake drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the knife I kept under my pillow a cold reassurance. Then, one evening, I got a call from Lucy. It was the first time we'd spoken since I'd left. Her voice was quiet, strained. "Charlie," she said, I need to see you." We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, a neutral space where the weight of our past felt slightly less oppressive. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed, and her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of conversations around us filling the void. "Mark's in jail," she began, her voice trembling. "They're holding him on multiple charges. The lawyer says it doesn't look good." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry, Lucy. I didn't want any of this." "I know," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "But he's my brother, Charlie. He's all I have left." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell her that she had me, that I hadn't walked away because I stopped caring. But the truth was, I'd chosen survival over love, distance over danger. I couldn't protect her from Mark without losing myself in the process. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "Just talk to him," she said. "He's in a bad place, and maybe hearing from you will, I don't know, make him understand." I hesitated. The thought of facing Mark again, of stepping back into that storm, made my pulse quicken. But Lucy's plea hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting the three of us. "All right," I said finally. "I'll try." The county jail was a cold, sterile place, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the gray walls. I sat in the visitors area, the hum of security doors, and the occasional muffled conversation filling the space. When Mark was brought in, his appearance startled me. He'd lost more weight, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken, but the fire in his gaze hadn't dimmed. If anything, it burned brighter. "You've got some nerve showing up here," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm not here to fight, Mark," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Lucy asked me to come. She's worried about you." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Worried? That's rich. You think this is her fault? Yours? You don't get it, do you? I've been fighting my whole life, and I'm tired, Charlie, tired of losing." His words hung in the air, heavy with a truth I couldn't ignore. I'd spent years learning how to fight, how to survive. But Mark's battles had been different. Quieter, more insidious, waged in the shadows of his own mind. And now, those battles had brought him to the edge. "You don't have to keep losing," I said after a long pause. "It's not too late to turn things around, but you have to want it, Mark. No one can fight this for you." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or regret. But it vanished, as quickly as it came. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You think you're some kind of savior?" he sneered. "You can't save me, Charlie. You couldn't even save yourself." The words stung, but I didn't flinch. "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I'm still here. And so are you. That's got to count for something." The visit ended, with no resolution, no cathartic breakthrough. As I left the jail, I felt the weight of our fractured connection pressing down on me. Mark's journey was his own, and no amount of intervention could force him to change. But as I stepped back, into the cold evening air, I felt a glimmer of hope, that maybe, just maybe, he'd find his way out of the darkness. The weeks that followed my visit to Mark felt like walking through a dense fog. Life carried on in its unrelenting rhythm, but every step felt heavier. My shifts at the warehouse blurred together, and the simple routines I once clung to now felt hollow. The weight of everything, Lucy, Mark, and the violence that had shattered our fragile balance, pressed down on me like a lead blanket. Mark's trial was looming, a shadow growing larger with each passing day. Lucy and I exchanged only brief, strained conversations. She oscillated between quiet resignation and bursts of frantic energy as she prepared for the courtroom, determined to be there for her brother despite everything. I admired her loyalty, but I couldn't share her hope. Mark's trajectory seemed unyielding, a train speeding toward an inevitable crash. The day of the trial arrived with an eerie stillness. I went, not out of obligation, but because I needed closure, needed to see for myself how this chapter would end. The courthouse was a cold, imposing structure, its high ceilings and polished floors amplifying every sound. I sat in the back, separate from Lucy, who sat with her hands clasped tightly together at the front. Mark was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled. His face was unreadable, a mask of hardened indifference. As the judge read out the charges, I scanned the room, noting the faces of strangers who'd come to witness this spectacle of justice. It struck me how small Mark seemed in that moment, swallowed by the machinery of a system that had little patience for nuance or personal tragedy. The proceedings were straightforward. The evidence was clear. Mark had broken into my apartment, armed with a weapon. He had a history of violent outbursts and a prior record of petty crimes. His defense attorney argued for leniency, citing his addiction and mental health struggles, but the prosecutor countered with a relentless narrative of Mark as a danger to society. The judge's decision was swift. Mark was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Lucy broke down as the gavel struck, her sobs echoing in the sterile courtroom. Mark was led away without a word, his eyes briefly meeting mine as he passed. There was no anger in his gaze, no plea for understanding. Just a hollow resignation that settled deep in my chest. In the days after the sentencing, I tried to focus on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, took up running to quiet my restless mind, and began seeing a therapist to unpack the tangled mess of guilt and anger that had rooted itself within me. But Mark lingered in my thoughts, a constant reminder of the life I tried to escape and the people I couldn't save. Then came the news that shattered the fragile peace I'd begun to rebuild. Mark was dead. He'd been involved in a fight with another inmate and succumbed to his injuries before help could arrive. The phone call from Lucy was brief and broken, her voice fractured by grief. I'd known this was a possibility, had seen, enough to understand the dangers of prison, but hearing the words still felt like a gut punch. Attending his funeral was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. It was a small, somber affair, with only a handful of people in attendance. Lucy stood at the front, her face pale and drawn, as the priest spoke words of solace that felt hollow against the weight of loss. I stayed at the back, unsure of my place in this final act of Mark's story. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief, certainly, but also an aching emptiness. Mark's life had been a series of battles he couldn't win, a spiral of pain that had ultimately consumed him. And though I'd tried to distance myself, his struggles had become intertwined with my own. His death wasn't just an ending, it was a stark reminder of how fragile the line between survival and surrender truly was. In the days that followed, I reached out to Lucy. We met in a park, the crisp autumn air carrying with it a sense of quiet reflection. We talked about Mark, about his pain and the moments of light he'd shown despite it all. For the first time in a long while, there was no blame, no recrimination, just two people trying to make sense of a loss that felt too large to comprehend. I keep thinking about what I could have done differently, Lucy said, her voice soft and raw. We both do, I replied, but Mark made his choices. All we can do now is learn from them and try to move forward. She nodded, her eyes distant but resolute. In that moment, I saw a glimmer of the strength that had drawn me to her in the first place. Despite everything, Lucy would endure just as I would. Mark's death had left a scar, but it was one we'd carry together, a reminder of the battles we'd fought and the lessons we'd learned in their wake.